thank you for coming back for the Chapter 5 reading of Dolor and Shadow. And again, this is the blog hop, festive blog hop, posted by Frances H. Powell. So I'm going to go ahead and get started reading. And in this chapter, there's a lot of old Celtic words. I never studied the Celtic language, so I'm going to butcher this Old Irish, and I'm sorry. I feel bad, but okay. And this is back to Gunir. It says Gunir at the top. The high morning sun bathed the castle gardens of Gunir with a touch of gold. Keen Tryggve breathed deep the warm spring air. The willow trees wept with streams of fresh buds. Their whip-like branches draped over the garden's lake. He watched with a contented grin as a lone swan plunged its head into the water and up again, its silver eyes glistening in the sun. Beads of water rolled down its white back. The swan caught sight of Tryggve, and he watched her swim to the edge of the lake where the water was most shallow. Her feathers ruffled, her head bowed, and he watched, entranced, as the swan shifted its form into that of a woman with generous curves and perfect skin as white as the bird. Her hair, as pale as spring sunlight, fell down her shoulders, breasts, and back. She raised her head and smiled at him. Her teeth like pearls, he thought, and felt his breath leave his body. He watched, enraptured, as she walked from the lake to a small stone bench beneath a willow where she had abandoned her robe an hour ago. With graceful ease he watched his wife wrap her body in the robe. His eyes followed the slender curve of her face, her eyes, and the locks she pulled free from the fabric. "Your eyes still take my heart as completely as the day we met," he said, as she made her way toward him. "Kallan." He took up her hands and placed his mouth upon her palm. "Such words," she said, smiling. "True words," he corrected, and pulled her into him. "You take my breath from me." He buried his face into her neck, and she laid her head into his. "The children are gone," he whispered. "So you shall have me, is that it?" she asked. "Always have, always will. So long as you'll let me." He grazed her neck with his gentle kisses. "Is for too," she whispered back, and Tryggve exhaled, pulling himself from her neck so that he could look into her eyes. "You know I can't stand a word of your unsweet tongue." He kissed her mouth. He released her and kissed her brow. "I know that," she said. "Say it again." He kissed the lids of her eyes. "Is for too." He smiled and kissed her mouth again hard and deep until he had his fill. "Tryggve?" she asked when he returned to her neck. "The children are gone, you say?" He kissed her neck deeper and wrapped an arm around her waist. "Swan is off where Swan always is, in the valley." He kissed the tip of her nose. "Rune has vanished?" Kallan shifted to better look into his eyes. "Where is he?" Garl said he skipped out on his lessons. He raised his palm. He raised her palm and kissed her wrist. "Will you reprimand him?" Kallan asked. "I will." Tryggve kissed her brow again. "Not care." She smiled and Tryggve kissed her mouth. "What aren't you telling me, husband?" "Later," he whispered. "Tryggve?" He sighed, ceased his kissing, and wrapped his other arm around her. "Rumor has slipped from the docks." He hated himself for saying it. "It would appear that our son is home." "Bergen?" Tryggve nodded, knowing his plans for the morning were quickly slipping from him. "Bergen is?" Tryggve nodded. Kallan beamed, and heat flooded his insides. "Where is he?" Tryggve sighed. "I have a suspicion that Rune has taken it upon himself to find him." "Well, then why are we here?" she said, and was off, free from his arms as she ran across the gardens toward the keep. "Yes, love." Struggling to think of little else but the curve of his wife's backside, Tryggve ran his hands over his face and turned to join his wife. "Whatever you ask, my love, I shall give it." Tryggve took a step and stopped. She stood stiffly, her head bowed, frozen as if in pain. "Kallan?" She turned, her eyes brimming with fear. "Something is wrong," she gasped. Only once before had he seen her like this. Once, years ago, and she hadn't been wrong then either. Tension pulled his back taut with worry. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Kallan?" "The children," she muttered. Before Tryggve could run toward the keep, Kallan shifted back into a swan and took flight. From the garden she flew over the parapet to the courtyard, while Tryggve fled up the steps to the kitchens. Panting, he threw open the door, slamming into the cook while he made his way to the steps of the main hall. Paying no mind to the decor of the feast, Tryggve charged the grey oak doors. Geoff called, but Tryggve ignored him and punched open the doors to the courtyard. "Please," he heard Quailin's plea, and the colour drained from his face. Upon the steps, wrapped in the remnants of a gown, lay Swan, naked and drained of blood that had now covered her young body. From her navel to her chest, her body had been cut, gutted like one of the animals brought to slaughter. A handprint of dried blood marred her face, where her lifeless silver eyes stared into nothing. Beside her, Bergen and Rune waited while Quailin splayed her hands onto Swan and sent streams of gold into the lifeless child. "Quailin, no!" Tryggve cried, and fell to his knees alongside his wife and daughter. "You can't give too much, she'll die." Quailin increased the flow of her scythe. "Quailin!" Tryggve clutched her arms and tried to pull her away. "Le dothriel," she said. "Ni le dothriel ba, please." But she drew too much, and when she linked her scythe to Tryggve, she was unaware of the life she took from him. Tryggve felt his arms weaken, his head spun with darkness, but Quailin didn't break the link. "I can save her," she muttered. But Swan lay unmoving, not breathing, while the scythe drained from Quailin. Tryggve released his wife. His scythe came back, his eyes focused, and he watched Quailin pour her life into Swan. The child lay on the courtyard steps. "I can... Shavel," Quailin muttered. "Nearly dothriel." She was pale now. "I can say..." The scythe line broke, and Quailin fell back into Tryggve's arms. The red of her lips were almost white. The gleam in her eyes were fading. She's given too much," Tryggve said. He brushed her waxen face with a shaking hand. "Geralf," he muttered. "Where's Geralf?" The king searched the many faces that had gathered to see. Too helpless to change the fates, too stunned to cry or weep, they only looked on in silence and dismay. "Quay." Her skin was grey. Her breath was broken. The light in her eyes were fading. "Nile dothriel," and she gave her last breath. Tryggve's head spun. "My wife." He touched her white lips. "My daughter." He turned to Swan, seeing but not understanding. "Rune," Tryggve said. "Bergen?" Neither moved. "What happened?" Tryggve asked. "How?" Geralf was there, leaning closer to inspect the queen. "We found her," Rune said. "The valley." Tryggve gazed upon Swan, so like her mother, blood covering her pale skin. He shook his muddled head and shifted his gaze to Quailin, waxen and grey in his arms. His hands had grown cold. He felt Geralf shift to touch her neck, and the king raised his bewildered eyes to the old man. "Geralf!" Geralf's eyes glazed over with a wall of tears, and he looked to his king. With a quivering lip, Geralf shook his head, and Tryggve felt his sanity leave him. With trembling hands he raked his scalp and pulled at his strands of hair, one hand still clamped to his wife. "Who?" He couldn't finish. He couldn't speak. "Why?" Tryggve turned his attention to his daughter, his wife, his sons. Bergen stood, shaking, breathing as if chilled by a mountain storm. Rune stood beside him, his fingers clutching something until his knuckles were white beneath the blood. Blood covered their faces, their clothes, their hands. Blood now covered Quailin. Swan's blood. "Ha!" Tryggve could say no more. Shaking, Rune extended the white-knuckled hand that clasped a silver band of metal. It struck the courtyard stone, punctuating the silence like a deadened weight. Tryggve shifted his crazed eyes to the object, an elding armband, engraved with a tri-corner knot and a hammer. "Dakafar," Geralf sputtered. "Eof," Tryggve muttered. Rage consumed him and pushed the confusion and grief aside until only fire burned and it severed his senses. Wild rage, cold hate took Tryggve and ripped his mind from him. With a single thought, he raised his eyes to the south. Lorlenalin. "Get my sword." Rune gazed at the lifeless faces staring up at him, paying no mind as his father called for his sword and ran to the stables. Torun had joined them and muffled her sobs into her skirts. Gently she wrapped the bodies in cloth, while Geralf took up Quailin's body. "Take care of Swan," Geralf muttered to someone, but Rune heard nothing. Bergen remained at his side, his shoulders shaking, his hands curled into white fists. His hair hung over his face, hiding the rage that shook him. The shock was wearing off. The wave of crying had begun. Someone took up Swan's body and carried her into the keep. The sky was grey. Blood, Swan's blood, stained the steps of the keep. The armband lay where it had fallen. Forcing his body to move, Rune took up the band and trudged down the steps and started for the barracks. The door creaked. The barracks were empty. Rune stopped in the doorway and gazed at the collection of swords and armaments. His eye stopped on a single sword. Still clutching the armband, he withdrew it. Hate boiled, rage rose. Rune screamed and swung the blade. His shoulders shook and he swung again. Images of his sister's body, stripped and broken, bleeding and dead, swarmed him. Her body left to die in a pool of her own blood. He swung the blade again and again. Bergen had roared and taken up Swan's body. Rune had dug at the earth with his fists. He didn't know how long they sat there screaming over her body. Rune swung the blade. He roared, letting his voice shred his throat with the same agony that clawed his chest, and lunged, swinging again, then bringing the blade down into a table, down to the wooden floor. He remembered the armband lying in the grass. Rune swung the blade, and it shattered in two. He dropped to his knees and stabbed at the floor with a half-blade, while the tip clambered to the ground somewhere. The dagger used to gut her had been left. Rune had run off, shouting to the murderer to come out, while Bergen rocked Sweet Swan and roared. Rune dug at the floor and over until the blade broke again. With his fists he punched the floor and dug at the planks until his knuckles bled. And then Mother? His mind couldn't process. Anguish clamped his chest and dug itself into his heart. Rune shook his head and punched his brow. He pulled at his hair and dug his scalp, desperate to find the Dokafar and kill him. The barracks door struck the wall. Rune remained kneeling on the floor, yearning to find another sword and slash away at the world. Father's gone, he heard Bergen say. I'm going after him. Where? Rune asked. Screaming had begun to pass over Gunir. To hunt Dokafar, Bergen said. Rune raised his face to his brother. Cold hate penetrated the silver blue of Bergen's eyes. I'll get the horses. The wind howled over the hundreds that lay dead on the forest floor. Rune tightened his hold on the reins. He couldn't see the end of the massacre through the steam. Too stunned to speak, he stared at the Dokafar women, the children, the soldiers, and horses, as Bergen spoke. Hundreds lay dead for me, silenced, they weep for thee. Blood spilled where now they'll be. A raven cawed. The first of the flock were gathering. Silence the hundreds. The stench of the dead was growing. Within the hour, the field would be crawling with scavengers. This was how King Eyolf would find his kin. There was little time to act. Rune turned his horse around. All taste of vengeance had left him. What are you doing? Bergen asked, and turned his horse to follow. There will be war, Rune said. The Dokafar king won't dismiss this, nor should he. Bergen pulled back on his reins and looked at the dead. Rune stopped his horse and turned. Bergen, he said, we need to go back. We need to find father before the Dokafar do. Bergen stared, not moving, the hate in his eyes unyielding. Bergen, Rune said. It was another long moment before Bergen steered his horse back around to follow his brother. Chapter 6 will be published tomorrow, and this was Dolor and Shadow, Chapter 5 of Dolor and Shadow. And if you like what you heard here, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, from the 16th to the 24th of December, we will be doing a 2-chapter a day book reading, along with a featured author. So by all means, tune in later. Thank you.